Hi, my name's Faye Carl. I run a wedding cake studio in Sydney, and today at Paul Bradford I'm here to show you how to make this 3-tier Art Deco wedding cake. So as you can see, there's a whole lot of techniques that we're covering in creating this 3-tier cake with 3 different patterns. Join me in lesson 1 and we'll get started. So in this lesson, we're going to start by ganaching our cake. So our bottom tier is a hexagon. The sizes that we're using in this cake are a 5-inch, 7-inch, and the bottom hexagon, the widest point here is 9.5 inches and the shorter side is 8 inches. So I use the lid technique to ganache the cake, which means we use two cake boards, and we need to make sure they line up perfectly. So in this set that I have, some of the angles don't match up exactly, so we're going to need to make sure we use those in the right orientation to make sure the lines are exactly perfect on our finished cake. One of these we have a hole drilled through, so if we were doing this as a real cake order, there would be a centre pole in the drilled into the baseboard, and we would do the ganache stage on a separate working board, and then after it's covered, we thread that onto the centre pole and then stack them all over a centre pole for the stability. So in this lesson, I'm doing it without a centre pole, so I'm just going to put it straight onto the board that will be the finished presentation board. And we just use a little ganache to stick that down. Okay, so just a little ganache, and then because this is the board that it's going to stay on, we want to make sure that's centered correctly. And then I'm just going to check my lid, and I've put a mark on the lid and a mark on the baseboard here, so when we come to put the lid on, we're going to line up these 2 marks here. So now we can put the lid away, and we'll start splitting our cake. Okay, so the design that we're doing, the tier height is going to be 5 inches, which is, in my studio, that's our most common tier height. And to get 5 inches of cake, 5 inches of finished height, we need roughly 4 inches of cake, and the other inch is the ganache layers. So to get that, mostly we need two cakes, so we can get three layers out of our first cake, and then we use a layer from a second cake. So I have the leveler set at 2-inch increments. So this should give us roughly what we need here. Okay, so these 2 are good, and so that's 5 layers. One's not completely perfect; it has some rounded bits, but I would still use that, and we'll be trimming it off a lot for the hexagon shape. So I think we can use that one up in this design. So then we're going to trim them roughly into the hexagon shape. I think it's easier to trim the individual layers rather than trim it when it's in the full cake, because it's quite easy to go on an angle, and then the shape you end up trimming too much, or messing up the shape. So I'm just going to trim all of the layers. So this is just a rough trim, and we will be trimming it more in the next stages. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and trim all of our layers down to the rough hexagon shape. So then we can start stacking up our layers. So just using ganache as a glue. So the ganache we have melted down in the microwave just to sort of like a peanut butter consistency. So when it's at room temperature, it's at quite a firm block, and to use, we just need to warm it up a little in the microwave to this kind of consistency. Now, at this stage is where we would use syrup. If you're using syrup, for the video I'm not going to syrup the layers, but in my studio we use just a simple syrup with 10% alcohol, and that just keeps it all really moist and tasty. So just spreading on the ganache where the layers are roughly half to 1 centimetre of ganache. So it can help to make sure this process goes smoothly to start with your cake straight out of the fridge. So if it's cool at fridge temperature, everything will set up a little bit quicker. In my studio, we work we're quite busy, so we're working on a lot of cakes, and the process that we do is that we might be working on up to about 8 tiers of cake at a time, and so we do each process. So we layer all of the cakes, then we stack them up, and then they're cooling in the fridge. And so by the time we get to the 8th cake, the first cake is nice and cool again, so it makes the next stage go really quickly. And we also do a little bit of measuring during this process. So usually you want your tiers to be pretty consistent with height. The bottom tier can be a little bit higher. So if your measurements aren't exact, it's okay if the bottom tiers are higher than the top tiers, but it usually doesn't look nice if the top tiers are higher than the bottom. So for my bottom tier, we want to make sure it has to be at least 5 inches, and it can be a little bit more. Okay, so this is pretty much exact. Once I put my top layer of ganache on, it'll be sitting at pretty much exactly 5 inches. So right now I'm not going to put the top layer on, I'm going to start trimming the sides. So what we want to create here is a gap between the board and the cake of about half a centimetre. It will help if you put it at this stage in the fridge and make it nice and firm. It will help get really nice clean cuts when you're trimming. It hasn't warmed up too much, so I'm going to just start trimming that right now and see how we go. Okay. So that's kind of what we're looking for. So you can see this gap here on the board. It's roughly about 1/2 to 1 centimetre, and we just want to check that with a right angle. It's quite common for it to either go in or go out, and you definitely don't want that to angle out where you don't have the right gap at the top. So this gap between my right angle here and the cake is what we're going to fill with ganache, and that's going to give us our nice firm surface to ice over. So that side is good, and I'm just going to continue right around the cake. So I'm going to continue this around each of the sides of the cake, and then in the next stage we'll move on to the crumb coating. Okay, so now we're ready to crumb coat. We have our tier nicely trimmed, and I'm just going to do a layer right over the top. And then take that down the sides. So always with this process, we're trying to stay inside our finish line. So our finish line is, if you remember, it's the right angle here. That's where our shape is, and we're just keeping our ganache layers inside that. So this is just another rough layer. You may need to go in and out of the fridge a couple of times in this process, depending on your conditions. So if at any stage it's feeling hard to work with, it's getting hot and sticky, then just back in the fridge it will become easier to work with again. Okay, so we're just trying to cover up all of the crumb, and then we'll do our final layer on top of that. Okay, so that's all roughly covered, and I'm just going to do a little scrape around to make sure that hasn't gone outside the finished line. So most of that is good. I'm just going to take a little off. Okay. All right, so the next stage is to flatten off the top surface. So for right now, we're just going to forget about the sides completely and get the top nice and smooth. So for this process, I use my long flat scraper. You can use a ruler. Anything with a straight line is good. I like this one. It's slightly flexible, which I find just has a nice feel to work with. So in these conditions that I'm working with now, it's firming up fairly quickly. So you can see when the ganache is warmed up, it has a slightly glossy look to it, and then as you start scraping it, it goes dull, and that's what we're looking for. So we want a nice flat surface on top. So this first scrape down is just rough, and now I'm just going to do a little measure and check our height. So 5 inches is the same as 12.5 centimetres. So right now I've got that to 12 centimetres. I need to add a little ganache on there. Okay, because we've used the leveler, it's quite consistent all the way around. So if you're hand cutting your layers, sometimes it can go a little bit uneven, and you just want to check that. If your top's not level, you might want to add some ganache on one side, just to make sure that's all leveled up. Okay, so now I'm just adding a nice thick layer to add that little bit of height that we need to get the correct height. Okay, so now because I've added quite a thick layer there, it's going to take a little bit more to firm it up. So I might just put that in the fridge just for 10 minutes or so, help it set a little bit more, and then we can do a final layer on that top surface there. I'm just going to pop this in the fridge now, and in the next lesson we're going to finish that top layer and then start working on the sides. Okay, so now we're ready to put the finishing layer on the top surface here. So let's just check the height one more time, and we're getting close to the 12.5 centimetres. Okay, so I'm just going to put another layer of ganache on top here. And with this layer, we are trying to get outside the finished line of the cake. So we're building out a little bit of a hat, sometimes we call it. And then when we put the lid on, we're going to trim that back to the finished line. It's got a little lump there I'm going to take out. Okay, so I'm just looking by eye. I can see that's roughly level, but we will be doing a bit of measuring as well. Okay. And now just spinning the cake and scraping. So I have one side of the scraper in the middle, and then one side is skimming around the outside. And it can take a little bit of practice. I find sometimes in classes it's quite common that students angles the scraper a little bit and the edge goes down a little bit, but we're just trying to keep it all completely level. So that can happen especially if your cake starts to warm up and the ganache gets too soft. Okay, so this is what we're looking for from the ganache being quite shiny when we've put it on freshly to going dull and drying out a little. Okay. All right, so part of this is exactly right, and then part is going a little bit low, so I'm going to put some marks where we're a little bit low. Okay, so this whole section here is a little bit low, and this section is the right height. So now I'm going to apply ganache only to that section that's lower. And then just skimming over again to get that level. So now there was just a very small little dip here, so I'm just going to add a tiny bit more. Okay, so now we have that top surface level, and we've built it out a little bit so it's outside the line of the board, and that's where we need it to be for our next section. So I'm going to put the lid on, but I want to make sure that the lid doesn't stick and pull off the ganache when we remove it. So I'm just going to put this into the fridge for a couple of seconds, and then we'll come back and we'll do the final lesson in this stage, which will be filling up the sides. Okay, so for this lesson we're going to finish our ganache stage using the lid. We use the shiny side down onto the cake surface, and then to make sure we can get that back off again, we're just using a little bit of water. So I'm just going to put on a little bit with my hands. A spray bottle is good for this, it keeps it nice and food safe. Okay, now if you remember, we're using the mark that we made on the board earlier, and we want to line that up with the mark on our baseboard here, which will make sure our top and bottom boards are aligned. And then we're using a right angle, and we want to check all of our alignment of this top board to make sure it's directly perpendicular over the bottom board. Okay. So just checking all of those angles. We'll be checking this a few times during this final process. Okay, so that looks good. The first thing is that we're going to trim off all of this excess from the top edge here. And sometimes we need to use a hot knife for that if it's gone quite hard. Okay, and then just in case that might have moved in that trimming process, we're just going to have another little check here. Okay, so I'm just going to give a little scrape and using a little bit of downward pressure on the top edge just to try and keep that in place and make sure it doesn't move. So now we can start filling out the sides, and we're just creating a flat surface in between those two boards. So using those as your guide. And just applying more soft ganache. So you can see in the bit of the lid that the top surface that firmed up there, how firm it is when it's at room temperature. It's quite solid. Okay, so I'm just going to fill out a couple of sides and then scrape those back just in case it gets a little bit hard by the time I've worked my way all the way around. So you can see in these first two sides we're starting to get to our finished shape there. And so if there's quite a big gap to fill there, we still want the ganache to be sort of reasonably firm, I guess, not too runny. And then as we get to our final stages, you can make it a little bit looser, just to fill all of those finer gaps at the end. If you have made it too runny, it might just slow you down a little bit. It's still fine, but you might just need to put it in and out of the fridge a couple of times just to get it to the final stage that we're looking for. Okay, so at this stage, we're looking to get it pretty close to the finished shape, but we will just do one final layer of runnier ganache on the outside just to get a nice, smooth outside finish. So I've got a couple of lumps there. They're just a little bit of the firmer ganache that went back into the bowl. And so they would be fine to leave in, except it's going to be hard to get that smooth finish on the outside. Okay, so I'm just going to do a little scrape around the base as well. So we don't want to cover that baseboard, we want that still to be visible. So if that was covered, then the line wouldn't be exactly right between the top and the bottom. Okay, so sometimes during this process, if you're working quickly and you've started with a cold cake, then maybe that's firmed up enough to do your final runny layer on the outside. I might just, it's pretty close, but I might just put it in the fridge for 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll do our final smooth layer on the outside and take off the lid. So we'll come back and do that in the next lesson. Okay, so now it's time to finish off this tier. I've put that in the fridge. Now we're going to do a final layer of a little bit runnier ganache, so we've just softened this up a little bit more. I've just made sure all of those hard lumps are incorporated, and we're going to apply that to the outside. So what I find can help in this stage is if we use our scraper to apply a little ganache. So this layer we want to get as smooth as possible. So this is our final layer, and the smoother we get this, the easier it will be to get a nice clean finish in your covering. Okay, so what we're looking for here, if we create a line between the top and the bottom boards, we don't want to see any air through that. So having a look at that there, it's very marginal. I can see like maybe 1 millimetre in the centre of the tier there where we could fill that out a little bit more with ganache. So how fussy you get with this stage might depend on what the decoration's going to be. So for our design, I think that would be fine. I don't think we would need to worry too much more about that. But for example, if we were stenciling on that, you want to get it as perfect as possible. You don't want any dips in there where it's going to cause problems with the bleeding through the stencil. So there's not that much to fill out here, so I'm just doing a really thin layer, just getting out all of those last imperfections. And then obviously we want to keep an eye on the corners here, so we want those to be nice and straight and sharp. And so if we find we've got a little rough bit that's come out the side there, then we just want to scrape that off. Okay, so just working around the cake and finishing every side, and then once we're finished this, we're going to take the lid off. Okay, so we're looking for any little pockets, empty pockets that might need to be filled out, because obviously once you cover, that might create an air bubble. And if we find any of those, we just add a little bit more ganache and then scrape over. Okay, so this is getting pretty close now. All right, so I think that's looking pretty good. Just going to scrape off the ganache off the cake board. Okay, so I just have one side where I've gone a little bit too far over and covered up the cake board. I'm just going to scrape that back a tiny bit. Okay, so I think we're good now. I'm going to now take off the lid, and then we'll be pretty close to finish. So what I have here is just some hot water. I've been heating up my knife, and I'm just going to take that and now run it under the board on top here. So what I'm doing is just running that around the entire cake using just some gentle upward pressure, and that should pop off. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. There's a little defect here. We need to fill out a couple here. Sometimes you need to do a little bit more finishing on top, but this one's not going to take too much. All right, so if there is any ridges, for example this one here that's come up a little bit high, we just need to take that off. And obviously just working quickly so we don't lose our shape. So especially if it starts to heat up too much, it's going to be really easy to lose those lines that we've just worked to create. So all I really need to do is fill a couple of holes here, and we're pretty much done. Okay, and in scraping that back, you are going to go outside the lines a little bit, but if we work really quickly, you can just take that straight off again. Sometimes what we do in my studio, because we ganache our cakes one day and then we cover the next day, we might say if we've got to this stage, we might just leave those little extra bits on top there. The next day we can just use a sharp knife, cut those off, and then we've gone back to our nice straight edge. But today I'm going to, because I'm covering straight away, I'm going to drag those in to the center to get rid of them. Okay, so there it is. All I need to do now is clean up the cake board. As I mentioned, in my studio, we would then be leaving that to set overnight and covering it the next day. So it's when you're using firm ganache, it's usually fine to cover straight away. However, it's always easier if you do it the next day. So I'm just going to clean this off, and we'll come back for our next stage, which will be covering in fondant. So now we've got our ganaching out of the way, we can move on to covering, and we can start seeing our cake come together. So what we're doing with this cake, the bottom tier is going to be lustered in a copper colour, and the top two are going to be matte peach. So I've mixed up this peachy colour. It's something that we're still using a lot of, these peaches and neutrals and nude sort of colours. So I've pre-mixed the fondant in this colour. What I've used to get that is this peach in the Rainbow Dust brand, and I found that when I started mixing that in, it was a little bit bright for me. I always like to soften things a little, so I've just added a little black into that. So that's given us a nice soft peach colour, which is still quite pastel-y, and then when we contrast that with the copper, it's going to pop really nicely. So I'm going to start covering. What I do to start with, we just want to brush some gel onto here. So what we use in my studio to stick the icing is a jam syrup. So it's basically just 60% jam, 30% water, and we boil those together. The jam we use is a apricot jam without particles in it, but you can use any jam and then just strain it if it does have particles in it. So the idea of using something like this is that we want, once we put our icing on, we want that to grip to the cake and not slide around too much. So it should be something that is a little bit viscous, so it's not going to slip around. We just want to put a thin coat of that on. If you make it too wet, it is going to slip, so we just want that covering the entire cake, but not too thick. And then once we've painted that on the whole cake, I'm going to take it off the turntable, and the rest of the process we do just directly on the bench and using some non-slip mat. So to start with, we just start kneading up the icing, and we can start rolling that out. Okay. All right, so once we've formed a smooth ball with that, we use some corn flour onto the bench, not too much. And then we can start rolling out. So what I'm aiming for is roughly 1/2 centimetre, 5 mils thick. For the icing is going to be a good thickness to get a really neat finish and get the sharp edges. So if you've gone thicker than that, then it's going to be harder to get the sharp edges, and then especially since we have quite a few verticals, we want those to look really neat as well. Okay, so just lifting and turning the icing just to make sure that's not sticking to the bench, and trying to work quickly so it doesn't dry out. So I usually judge the quantity of fondant and then also the size that we're rolling to. We do by eye, but of course you can measure just either with a ruler or a piece of string. You can measure what you need and then make sure your fondant is big enough. So once we've got it to the size that we need, I like to just skim the rolling pin over a little, and that's going to bring up any bubbles which we can now pop, and I've got my acupuncture pin. You can find these on eBay. They're pretty easy to get hold of and not expensive, and then we can pop these bubbles without leaving a hole. Okay, so on our bottom tier, this colour is going to be completely covered, so I'm not going to be too worried about any tiny little specks of chocolate or anything that might have got in there. And then we can bring our cake in. And roll the icing over. Okay, all right, so the first thing is to just smooth out the top surface here and make sure we haven't trapped any air under there, so just push out any little pockets of air that might have gone over the top. And then straight away we want to secure that top edge here just to make sure the weight of the icing doesn't drag and we get cracks there. Okay, so once we've done that, I usually work away from myself and then we just start bringing the icing in. So we're getting rid of all of these folds. We're just easing those into the side of the cake and just trying to push from the top down to the bottom to squeeze out any air. So covering a hexagon is a little bit trickier than a round, but it's probably easier than a square, I would say. The angles aren't as sharp, so we don't have as much excess fondant to bring in. Okay, and so at each stage we're usually pulling it out a little bit. Once we get to the next fold that we need to bring in, we just pull that out and then use a flat hand to ease it in there. Okay, so once we've got the fondant right down to the board there, I use a tool. This is a clay working tool that I use. There's a few different things that you can use, even the back of a paintbrush, anything just to... What I'm doing in this stage is just pushing the fondant into the crease here so we can get a nice clean cut at the bottom edge. So doing that on each side. Okay, and then we can trim off the excess. So just trying to keep the knife vertical, so not cutting in. And so now, just a quick smooth around that bottom edge. We're just going to tighten that up and make sure the fondant's sort of roughly in place at that bottom edge there. Okay, and then straight away we want to go back to the top edge. So this is the place where it's most likely to get any cracking, or it's going to dry out and have some defects there. So we want to work on that top edge while the fondant is still soft and before it skins. So I can see an air bubble here on the top. I'm just going to get that out. And because this one we're going to be lustering with a very strong colour, we don't need to worry too much about sticking a pin in and having a little chocolate spot on there. But if we were trying to keep that really perfect, then popping bubbles, you just want to do it on a shallow angle rather than vertical, and just stick it in there and then squeeze the air out towards the pin. Okay, and so now we're going to get these nice sharp edges on top, and to do that we're using 2 smoothers at a right angle. So these big ones are the ones that feel comfortable to me, but there's a few different types that are good. All you need is 2 straight edges, and then that's it. So we're using a little bit of pressure. So I've got my thumbs here, and I'm using my thumbs, the pressure of my thumbs, to squeeze the fondant into the sharp edge. Just working along. Okay, so you can see that first edge has come together. So exactly how sharp it is just a personal preference. So some people like it super sharp, some people like it just slightly rounded. Whatever you prefer is fine, just as long as it's consistent all the way around. So then just working one edge at a time until we've got all of the edges straight. And so this covering is slightly trickier because I've only just ganached the cake. If it was ganached yesterday and left to set, it would feel a little bit firmer, but it's coming together fine. All right, so now we've got the top edge. I can do a little bit more refining on those, which I'm going to do with the acetate. So I have my 2 pieces of acetate here, and this just allows us to do a little bit more refining. So if that needs to be sharpened up a tiny bit more, or just to buff out some rough patches, then we can use these guys. So now we'll start to work on the sides. So we spend quite a bit of time on the sides of our cakes, just using the acetates and buffing them. And if you've worked quickly and your fondant hasn't skimmed, then you can get quite a lot of defects out. So, you know, for example, if the fondant has stretched a little, you've got a rough patch. If you work over that quickly enough, it will often buff out. Okay, and then we want to sharpen up these edges as well. So I'm just using the acetates in a similar way, so making a right angle with those and using the pressure of my hand to push the fondant into a straight edge. So there's a little bit more that I'm going to do here to sharpen up these verticals, but to start with, I'm just going to buff out the sides. Okay, so we're starting to get to pretty close to our finished shape with the covering. I'm just going to do one more thing with the edges, and I'll show you that when we come back. Okay, so we've just got a tiny bit more to do on our covering, and then we can move on to decorating. So all we want to look at now is these vertical edges here. So what we find in the covering process, what you're doing is adding more weight to the bottom of the cake, and sometimes this line won't be perfect. So maybe you've got a bulge, and often that will be towards the bottom section there. So I've just switched to a slightly different smoother. This one has a flat edge on the bottom, which is going to allow me to just check these verticals. So I'm squeezing those together so it's going to sharpen it up slightly, but I'm also just trying to push out any bulges, and we're going to trim those off. So this one, it's come together quite nicely. There's not a lot of refining that we have to do, but I'm just going to squeeze those, and I've just pushed out a tiny little bit of excess fondant, which I'm going to trim off here. Okay, and so I've probably cut that a little bit too much on the side of the cake. So as much as possible, it's good to keep the cut a little bit vertical. So squeeze out your excess, cut that off, and then if we can If we can push the cut area right onto that edge there, that's going to be the least visible. Okay, and then just a little smooth over with these around the edges just to soften it off slightly. So if that's not perfectly straight, just smoothing this around a little bit is going to fix up that line. So I'm going to continue to do that on every corner of the cake. Then we'll come back and we'll luster this whole tier. So often what I would do is cover all of the tiers of cake, get that stacked up, and then treat that as a whole and do the whole decorating process. With this cake, because we've got luster on the bottom and the top two are matte, we're going to do the luster separate, then we're going to stack and then move on to the decorating. So we'll come back and do that in the next lesson. So now we're going to add the luster on the bottom tier, and what we're going for with this one is a very strong copper colour. So copper and rose gold and any sort of mixed metallics is something that's coming through very strongly at the moment. So we're going to do quite a strong look on the bottom tier and then contrast that with the soft peach on the top two tiers. So what I've done here is added the Rolcom Super Copper Luster. I've got 2 pots of that into the bowl, and then I've added the alcohol. So back home we have a cake decorator's alcohol which is 95%, and you're looking for something similar, so it should be around 95% to get the finish that we want on here. So the consistency that we want in the pot here is quite runny, so it's not too thick. If you're measuring it, a good proportion that will work is a tablespoon of luster to about 1/4 cup of alcohol. Usually we do it by eye, so we're just starting to paint that straight on. And again, you want to work fairly quickly in this process. The alcohol dries really fast, so we want to paint that on quite quickly, and then we're going to use a dry brush to get a nice smooth finish on there. So I'm not worried about the cake board at this stage. We're going to cover over that. Okay, so once we've painted the whole cake, we can use a dry brush and then just start to buff that out. So on the top surface, I use just horizontal strokes. And just keep going over that until the alcohol has evaporated. Okay, and then we can move on to the side. So on a round cake, we're using more of a spinning motion. On a hexagon, we can just use straight strokes all the way around. So just working one surface at a time here. Okay, and we're just going to continue that around until the alcohol has evaporated and we're getting that nice smooth surface on the luster. So luster can be used in different ways. Some people airbrush it, and that's a really nice, effective way of doing it. I like the brushing technique because I feel like it looks a little bit softer and a little bit more handmade. So the brushes that we use, you do leave a few very faint lines in the luster, and I think that looks really pretty. And so usually we will do two coats of luster. For example, if we were doing a whole cake in the same colour luster, we would work one tier at a time from the top to the bottom, doing the first coat, and then straight away we can go on to the second coat, and then again work one tier at a time from the top to the bottom. Okay, so this has gone on really nicely. But still we're going to do that second coat just to make sure it's all completely covered and we get a really pretty finish. So we can work straight away onto the second coat, just painting a whole second layer of luster over the top there. And just both brushes, the wet brush and the dry brush, make sure they're completely dry, so no traces of moisture at all in those, otherwise that's going to ruin the finish. You'll get some streaks in there. So if you find the alcohol can evaporate really quickly, so if you find it's gone a little bit too thick and you're getting some powdery or cakey sections, you can, and you're not getting those out with a dry brush, you can maybe have a separate clean brush handy and then just switch to a new brush that doesn't have any luster, and you'll find that will start to come together again. I've got a few tiny little bits on here, but mostly this is coming together really nicely. Can be a little bit messy, so actually this side here we're getting a few little powdery bits where it's thickened up too much. So to get rid of those, we do a little bit of side-to-side brushing, or move on to a new brush, and you'll find it will flick all over the place. So we need to do a little cleanup after we've finished here. The nice thing about these colours now is that there's lots of edible ones available. So in the past, some of these metallics we had to use non-edible highlighters, and usually it would be only on areas that you would remove before cutting. So now we can do whole tiers of cake like this that are completely edible. Okay, so there we have a whole copper tier. For example, if we wanted, if that's too strong and you wanted a softer look, you can use this copper and then add some white luster into there, and that's going to make a softer look. So you can mix together different colours, customise your finish. There's a whole lot of different colours that are pre-mixed available, but you don't need all of those. You can just have a few, and then you can mix those together and get what you want. So here's our bottom tier finished. Our next stage is going to be stacking up the cake, and then we can move on to decorating. So let's get our cake stacked up, and then we can move on to all the fun stuff, which is the decorating. So what we're going to do is dowel our bottom tier, and then we'll stack the upper tiers on that. So what we want for maximum stability, we want the dowels to be close to the diameter of your next tier. So I usually do it by eye, but a good method to do it would be to use a board that's just slightly smaller than your tier. So this is a 6-inch board. We have a 7-inch cake, and then we can just use that as a guide where to put our dowels. So I'm going to stick one in here, and then we're just going to use a food safe marker to make a mark here, and then pull it out and use some wire clippers to cut it. And then we'll just continue that for each of the each of the sides, doing 4 in total. Sometimes if we have just a tiny little 4-inch cake on top, I will use 3 rather than 4. Okay, and so now using a little royal icing, and we can stack up our tiers. So we've used some styrofoams for our upper tiers just for the video. So I'm not going to dowel this one. I'm going to stack the top tier right on that. If I was making this as a display cake and using styrofoam, then often I would want to skewer those together just so it doesn't come apart. Okay, so there we have it, our three-tier cake all ready for decorating. So we'll move on to that in the next lesson. Okay, so now we're ready for decorating. What we're going to be doing on this cake is a series of repeating patterns. And what I've chosen to do for this design is, because we have the hexagon, which obviously has 6 repeats, we're going to do each tier, the pattern will have 6 repeats, and that's going to line up and make the whole design look integrated. So first we need to divide the tiers into 6, and I'm going to start with the top tier. So just using some tracing paper, I've already started working on this one, but what I've done up until now is put that around the cake. So we do this after the cake is iced. We make a mark where the join in the paper is, and that gives us our area that we need to fill with pattern. So if it's a repeat of 4 or 8, you can just fold the paper, and that's going to give you your repeats. For other amounts, we measure it and then just divide it up and mark it off, which is what I've done on this one. So I'm going to be doing, on the top tier is going to be a design with scalloping and some applique and piping. So the applique and piping is going to be freehand, and what I'm doing for my pattern is a single scallop on the top here and a double scallop on the bottom. So in my first repeat, I've worked out one middle section of pattern, and then all I need to do is trace that into the other repeats. So I'm going to do that now. Once you've got one, you can just fold the paper and then start tracing over that. So now I've got it into 4 sections. We're just going to trace in the last 2, and then that's done. Okay, so now we have our pattern. I'm just going to pin that to the cake, and we want to line up one of those repeats to one of the facets on the bottom hexagon. Okay, so I have that lined up, and I'm just going to use a pin, putting that in where the pinholes will be covered with part of the pattern. And then this is a flower frilling tool, which I use as a scribe as well. And we're just going to make a line where these scallops are. Okay. All right, so there we have it, the lines just gently scribed into the surface of the cake. So now this tier is ready to start decorating. I'm going to be using some white fondant to put on our pattern and then embellish that with piping. Okay, so I've taken some white fondant and I've rolled that out, then passed it through the pasta machine and thinned it out to number 4 setting, which is quite thin. Now I'm going to just take half of this and put that aside in a covered bag for our applique pieces. And the other piece here, I'm going to pass through the fettuccine cutter to give us little strips of fondant that we're going to apply to the cake. Okay. So depending on your conditions and how much of this you're doing, you might want to keep that covered. This fondant is quite soft, so I think we'll have enough working time just to leave that out. All right, so I'm using gel, and we're going to start with the top edge and just put on one little segment at a time. Okay, so there's going to be a join at each junction here, and we're going to make a vertical cut. And just using fingers just to adjust that if it hasn't landed perfectly. If you needed to, you could use a circle cutter just as a guide there to make sure that's a nice smooth curve. So we're just continuing this around the entire tier. These pasta strips are something that we'll be using in the middle tier as well. So it's just something that's going to integrate the design together. On the top tier, it's only this one line around the top. Okay, so now there's our first line of decoration. Our bottom two scallops here we're going to do with little applique dots, which I'm going to cut out with a piping tip. So I might just save some of these pasta strips, which I'll be able to use on the middle tier. Okay, so I just need to grab a piping tip to cut out our little dots, and I'll come back and do that. Okay, so now I have my piping tip. It's a number 16, and we're going to be just cutting out a lot of dots and applying those to the cake. So this little section is quite time consuming. I think it looks really pretty done as applique, and it is I guess more accessible if you're not as confident with piping to do this. But if you wanted this bit to go a little bit faster, then we could pipe those dots on. Okay, so we're just going to paint a line of gel on there, and then pick up these one at a time and apply those to the cake. So you want to make sure there's one at each highest point, and then we can just fill in between there. So we're leaving just a tiny gap between each one. It's just going to help that go a little bit faster. So obviously trying to keep the spacing consistent. And this little section here is going to emulate, I guess, pearl swags, which we're also going to be using on the bottom tier. But this top tier is a little bit more of a lacy look. So just painting the second line here. And then applying a whole nother row of these little confetti dots. So there's our finished scallops in one segment. Then the other thing that we're going to do is just a single flower right in the center of the scallop there. So I'm going to cut that out. And stick that on. Okay. And so another thing that I often do on applique when it's meant to replicate lace is that I would just use a lace embosser to give a little bit of texture to this applique. So I think I'm going to leave that top line just exactly as it is, as a smooth line. But for the rest, I'm just going to impress a little bit of texture into them. And this is just a piece of plastic tablecloth that I found, but there's, yeah, it could be just one of your embossing mats or silicone molds. Anything like that is good. Okay, so that's all of our applique for one section. So now we're just going to repeat that for each segment here, and then we'll embellish that with piping. So now we might just continue with the applique and move on to the piping later. Normally in a production environment, that's how I would do it, working on one technique at a time, and often piping is the last thing. So to start with, we're going to do a border around the bottom edge, and then we can create our pattern over the top of that. So what I've scribed onto the cake here is this pattern which I've created. It's based on a popular pattern that we've done before on our real cake orders. I've adjusted it a little, so there's 6 repeats that fit onto a 7-inch tier. So it's compressed a little, but it's basically an Art Deco pattern constructed with lines. So it's something that in a multi-pattern design, I find that something a little bit geometric often works quite nicely, just so it doesn't get too busy or the patterns are clashing too much. So we're just trying to use some elements that are common in each of them. So it's scallop designs, the pasta strips, and yeah, little swags on each of the tiers. So I've scribed that on. I'm going to start with a border on the bottom, just so we can get a nice join when we start putting our pattern on. So for this one, I'm using a multi-bead mould. These kind of spongy white ones are, I find, a little bit trickier to use than the silicone moulds, but I have some that I really like, so I kind of struggle through with them. So what we're doing, this is reasonably deep, so if we just squashed fondant into there, it would be pretty chunky. So what I've done is I've rolled out fondant in the pasta machine just to the thickest setting, so number 1 setting, and I've cut some strips from that, and I'm going to lay those into the mould. So lining up one edge there, and then we can squish that in. Okay, and then where that second edge comes up there, I'm going to trim that off. And then just push that down. So there's just one little section here that needs an extra trim. Okay, and then we can pull that out, and we have our beaded mould. So I'm just using a half width of that, so I'm going to cut the whole thing in half, just being careful not to squash it. So now we can apply that to the cake. I'm just going to do paint a round of gel right around that bottom edge there. Okay, and just placing that on. And there will be 2 joins in this, so what I'm going to do is just try and line those up with one of the lines of the pattern so they're less noticeable. I'm just going to do that. I started placing it the wrong way up, so I want the cut edge to be down against the cake. Okay, so in this design I've added a couple of sections where the lines, instead of being the flat pasta strips, they're this beaded design. So in the semicircle here and in the top V, I'm going to add these little beaded sections as well. And then just adjusting to make sure it's a nice smooth curve, and then we can just continue right around the cake. Okay, and now these small V's at the top, we're going to do exactly the same, but just in 2 sections with a little vertical cut at the join. So here's our last little section of beading. I'm just putting on that last V. And now all I need to do is fill in all of the other lines with straight pasta strips. So I'm just going to start with the semicircles and then we'll move on to the straight lines. So I'm just going to demo one section and then continue with the rest. Okay, so this design works nicely if you get a point at the top here. And to do that, we do the angled lines before we do the straight lines. Okay, so just making a perpendicular cut there to get a nice sharp angle at the top. And so then what we need to do is cut two angles on this next piece and fit that into the join. Oops. Okay, so then we've got this section, we've got another little angle here between the two semicircles, but I'm going to put on the next semicircle and that will give us a guide for the next angled line. So this one went a little bit wobbly. I'm just trying to straighten it up a little. Okay, and so for our next angled line, we're going to do that cut again to do a nice point at the top there. So just painting the gel on. And then just using that cut again to get a nice V shape. So now I'm just going to continue that right around the cake and finish those lines, and then basically that tier is finished. So here's our pattern for the bottom tier. What we're going to be creating is pearl swag, so using individual placed edible pearls and piped beading, a tiny little bit of applique on this one. So I've just drawn that once, and I'm just going to use the same pattern for each tier. So just pinning that in place. Oh, where's my other pin? And exactly the same as before, just scribing the design. So again, we're using the scallop motif, so it's just going to tie in with what we've done on the top two tiers. And usually, most of the time on decorating a cake, I will work from the top to the bottom. I think there's less chance of damaging the work that you've already done if you're working that way. If it's the other way, there's a chance sometimes, for example, when I'm piping, I might be supporting my hand. I can touch the lower tiers, which would be a little bit risky. Okay, so once we've transferred that, we can use exactly the same pattern on every tier. Okay, so then I would continue that right around the cake, but right now I'll just put on the applique and show you that. So all we're doing is creating little medallions. I have this little mold. There's lots of similar things, or you could even create something with flower cutters. So just putting a little black fondant in there. And I find it easier just to cut the fondant and work it while it's in the mold rather than trimming it later. It's just a little bit quicker. And try not to squash it as you're pulling it out. Okay, so we'll do all the highlighting at the end. This is going to have some colour on it, but we're just going to stick it on there in black, and just in the centre of that motif that we've just created, just a little bit below the swag line, we'll place one of those on each tier, on each face. So I'm going to continue that on all of the faces and complete this section, and then we'll move on to the edible beading, which will be the next thing. So now we can move on to the edible beading. We're doing that on the bottom tier to create the pearl swags. So what I'm going to use is some, I think these would be 4 or 5 millimeter edible pearls. I'm just putting some of those into a bowl. And then we're just going to use a little bit of black shimmer and just swirl that around in the bowl with them. Okay, so once they've taken a lot of the colour on, we can transfer those onto a plate where they'll be easier to pick up and use. And then we can use gel to apply those. So since our fondant is still soft, we've just covered today, we can apply gel and then press those in, they will be secure. If you had to do them the day after you've covered, then we would use royal icing to secure them. But right now we're going to do just a few of these lines. If we did all of them, that would take forever. So just going to create a couple of heavier lines, and then the lighter lines will be done with piping. So I'll start with this top line. I use my fingers to apply beads. Some people prefer tweezers, but I find this is quicker. So we may have to go back over and then re-highlight those, but it will be quicker to colour them before putting them on the cake rather than after, because otherwise if you were highlighting them from white in this position, it would be hard just to get all around the beads. And then we're just going to continue the line over the other side. Okay, so they're the sections that we're going to bead with the larger beads, and we're going to do that on every face. So I'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll come back and we'll do the piping. Okay, so now I'm ready to start piping. We're going to start on the top tier, and then there's some more piping on the bottom tier. On the top tier, what we're going to do is accent the applique flower here with some leaves and some little piped 5-petal blossoms. So the leaves is one of the common things that I do as a filler, so it can be in a lacy design, or it can be just connecting little bits of applique together, and we're just basically drawing the outlines of small leaves. So as we're doing this, the technique is basically to go as close to the surface of the cake without touching, and to try and keep that consistent. And then try and keep the pressure that you're squeezing, keep that working with the speed that your hand is moving. So to get that, it's really just practice. So the more you do it, the more you'll get a feel for the pressure that you need. So there's a couple of little leaves. The 5-petal blossoms are pressure piping, so we're starting by keeping our piping tip in the same position for a short time, so squeezing out a dot of icing, and as the volume of that builds up, we just draw that into the center, and you can touch to the surface of the cake to finish that. So we've got 1 teardrop there, and we're going to create 4 more to finish the flower. I'm going to put a couple of those below the large applique flower. And then we're just going to put a pearl in the center of those, and also in the middle of the big one. So I've just piped a dot of icing, and we'll put a pearl here, and then also in the center of the 2 piped flowers. And then we can continue some leaves down to join the whole motif together. So now we're trying to integrate this as a group by using the leaves around the whole arrangement. Okay, so there's one little group of flowers, and we're going to continue that in each section, and that's going to create a really pretty lacy pattern. So I'm just going to continue that in each of the 6 segments, and then we'll move on to piping on the bottom tier. So now I'm going to do piped lines for all of these smaller inscribed lines that we have on the tier here. So all we're going to do is pipe tiny little dots along these lines. So the technique for piping dots is to go really close to the surface without touching, squeeze until you're happy with the size, then stop squeezing and pull away. So depending on how fussy you are, you can then go back and pat down all of those little peaks. Sometimes if we're only piping dots on a cake, we'll make the royal a lot softer, so it will ball up by itself and you don't have to worry about that second step of patting down. Most of the time it's not very noticeable. So just take your time, get the spacing and the size correct, and then it will just continue with all of the lines. So this is a design similar to what we do a lot. I guess the way I design is often heavier elements are towards the bottom and it gets lighter as it goes up. So this one is definitely has all of the heaviest elements at the bottom and the most complex design. And usually, always when I'm piping, I'm supporting my hand, so I'm never just hanging in space because I would be quite shaky, so it just always helps to have some support for your hand. So dots are one of the easiest things for piping, so it's a great thing just to start adding in, just to get more comfortable with piping, and then you can increase to different motifs and more complex things as you feel comfortable with it. So it's often what I do with my trainees as well. So when I start them piping, it's usually dots, and then they gradually move on to more complex things. So it does take a little bit of patience, and on a hexagon there's a little bit more surface area than there would be on a round, so that can increase the time. Okay, so there we have the rest of the beaded line. So that completes the beaded swag section. So I'm just going to do a little bit more accenting with some edible beading. So I'm using some of these different shaped dragées. They mostly come in silver. I'm going to be highlighting over the top of that in a different colour. So I've got one that's slightly teardrop shape, and I'm going to put that towards the top of our beaded teardrop. And then there's a flat one, which I think are called lentils, and I'm going to put that right here. So we're going to continue that round, and just a tiny bit more piping is just a little bit of pressure piping on this tier, just slightly more advanced but still not too tricky. So we're just going to start with building up a large dot and then dragging outwards, and then we're just going to continue that around this medallion here. Okay, so then we're pretty close to finishing the detailing. There's going to be a little bit of painting and then just one or two more little accents, and we're pretty close to being finished. So I'm just going to continue those previous steps on the other faces. So we've got our piping on the cake, and I'm going to give that some time to dry before I highlight it. So in the meantime, I'm going to cover the board around the cake. So this is the technique that we use. We cover the board after the cake is stacked up, sometimes before it's decorated if we have time, but otherwise it will be the final thing that we do. So I've rolled out some white fondant bigger than the size of my cake board, just 2 or 3 millimeters thick, and then using our lid from before, we're going to cut a hexagon from the center of there. Okay, then we can take that out. And so we'll generally choose a back of the cake. So I'm going to, for the video, I've been mainly decorating towards the front of the cake, so I'm going to put the join in the fondant at the back. So we just wrap that around. Okay, I like to get the fondant in place before I stick anything underneath, just because it's sometimes if it sticks in the wrong place, it can be hard to move. So then we're just going to put a little water or gel or syrup underneath there. Okay, and then often there might be a very small overlap at the back because the fondant has stretched a bit. We just trim. And then we just want to buff over that seam. So a lot of the time, if you're working quickly, you can buff that so it's hardly visible. Okay, and then we want to just do a little check and make sure that's gone in really close to the cake. So on this design, I'm going to do a little moulded trim, so we do have a little bit of room if it's not perfect, but If you're using a ribbon, then you want to make sure that's a really clean join between the cake board and the cake. So then we can trim. Okay, and then I'm just using a scraper and I'm going to finish the edge. So often that will have moved a little bit, so we want to get that back into place. And then we finish the edge by just bringing it to the edge of a bench here and then scraping that down to cut. So make a cut and then buff over. So I'm just going to continue to do that right around. Another good thing about this method is that it gives you a little bit of leeway. If the bottom edge of your covering isn't completely perfect, then the icing on the board is going to cover that slightly. So most commonly, I guess for wedding cakes where the board would be white or ivory, depending on the detailing on your cake. So this one we have white detailing, and we're going to ice the board white. So now we can trim the cake board with ribbon, and we're just using a glue stick. Okay, I'll grab the ribbon. And so usually the ribbon will be the same colour as the cake board. And starting at the back, just wrapping that around. Okay. So as soon as you start putting these finishing touches on it, the cake really comes alive. You can see that that's all looking a lot more finished and professional now. So in the next lesson, we'll be putting our moulded borders on the bottom and the top. We'll be doing some highlighting, and then we'll be finished with this design. Okay, so let's put our beaded trim onto our top and bottom tier. And these, I'm using the smallest bead mould here, which is the trickiest, and it can break a little, but generally it doesn't matter, it's easy to piece back together. So I've dusted a little corn flour into there. And for everything that we've done today, it's always 100% corn flour, not the one that has a little wheat flour in it. Okay, I'm just going to squish that in. Okay, so I'm just going to do my best to press that right down into the mould. It could help a little to use maybe some Tylose or even using flour paste instead of fondant for this. Mostly I would just use straight fondant. However, the fondant that we use at home is a little bit firmer than this one. So I'm giving that an extra little press down into the mould. And then I'm just going to try and separate that from the sides before I attempt to pull it out. Okay, all right, so this one's, looks like it's quite good. Just gently ease that out. Oh, there we go. Okay, so just sticking that with gel again. And obviously trying not to stretch it as you place it on. Okay. Oops. All right, so there's a little there I did stretch. I might just fix that up. Okay, and so I have some pieces for the top tier. So this design is quite nice in that all of the decorative elements are edible, so rather than using ribbons or other trims, we've got all moulded and piped detailing. So these little beaded borders, if you want those to look like pearls, they can be highlighted with some white or cream luster. I think for this design, we're just going to leave them as plain matte beads. Okay, so now our tiers are looking a little more finished. I might just replace that one when I continue all the back, but What I'm going to do now is start highlighting some of this bottom beading. So the royal should have had enough time to set, just enough to start highlighting that. And we're going to use some of the black luster that we were using earlier to pearlize these edible beads. I'm just going to add some alcohol into that, and we can use that as a highlighter. Okay, so all of these white beads we can highlight and turn those into charcoal. And then any of these, if they were handled a little bit too much and need touching up, they can get a bit. Mostly, I think they look good. So when you're using the luster as a highlighter, it's a thicker consistency, but do want it to be a little bit liquidy so it falls down the sides of the little balls of icing that we've created and gives a good coverage. Okay, so then we can move on to our second colour, which is going to be bronze, which is in the same family as copper, just a little bit lighter and a tiny bit of variation for the design. Okay, so we're going to paint these silver dragées are going to be bronze. And then all of these little piped details on the outside. Okay, and then one more thing, I'm just going to add one little pearl to the centre there. And then also highlight that in bronze. All right, so that face is finished, and I'm just going to continue the highlighting onto the rest of the cake. Okay, so I'm going to finish highlighting the detailing on this and just painting the last bits of bronze onto my dragées and my pearl. Okay, so there we have it. 3 tiers, different pattern on each tier, all complementary. So any of these could be used as a single pattern on a cake or in combination together. We've covered some highlighting, piping, edible beading, and yeah, there's a lot in there that could be applied to other projects as well. So I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to ask any questions and enjoy using these techniques. Thank you. I use the lid technique to ganache the cake, which means we use two cake boards, and we need to make sure they line up perfectly. Okay, so just a little ganache, and then because this is the board that it's going to stay on, we want to make sure that's centered correctly, and then I'm just going to check. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and trim all of our layers down to the rough hexagon shape. It's okay if the bottom tiers are higher than the top tiers, but it usually doesn't look nice if the top tiers are higher than the bottom. So for my bottom tier, we want to make sure it has to be at least 5 inches, and it can be a little bit more. So that's kind of what we're looking for. So you can see this gap here on the board. It's roughly about 1/2 to 1 centimetre. Okay. Gentle upward pressure, and that should pop off. Okay. So now we've got our ganaching out of the way, we can move on to covering, and we can start seeing our cake come together. What I do to start with, we just want to brush some gel onto here and roll the icing over. Okay, and then we want to sharpen up these edges as well. So I'm just using the acetates in a similar way, so making a right angle with those and using the pressure of my hand to push. So what I've done here is added the Rolcom Super Copper Luster. I've got 2 pots of that into the bowl, and then I've added the alcohol. And again, you want to work fairly quickly in this process. The alcohol dries really fast. So okay. And so now using a little royal icing, and we can stack up our tiers. Okay. All right, so there we have it. The lines just gently scribed into the surface of the cake. So we're just continuing this around the entire tier. These pasta strips are something that we'll be using in the middle tier as well. So it's just something that's going to integrate the design together. One at each highest point, and then we can just fill in between there. Okay, and then we can pull that out, and we have our beaded mould. So I'm just using a 1/2 width of that, so I'm going to cut the whole thing in half. Okay, so then I would continue that right around the cake, but right now I'll just put on the applique and show you that. So just putting a little black fondant in there. So I'm going to continue that on all of the faces and complete this section, and then we'll move on to the edible beading, which will be the next thing. So now we can move on to the edible beading. We're doing that on the bottom tier to create the pearl swags. I'm going to put a couple of those below the large applique flower. So the technique for piping dots is to go really close to the surface without touching, squeeze until you're happy with the size, and stop squeezing and pull away. Alright, so this one's looks like it's quite good. Just gently ease that out. And then any of these, if they were handled a little bit too much and need touching up, they can get a bit. Mostly, I think they look good. Okay, and then one more thing, I'm just going to add one little pearl to the centre there, and then also highlight that in bronze. Okay. All right, so that face is finished, and I'm just going to continue the highlighting onto the rest of the cake. Okay, so I'm going to finish highlighting the detailing on this and just painting the last bits of bronze onto my dragées and my pearl. Okay, so there we have it. 3 tiers, different pattern on each tier, all complementary, so any of these could be used as a single pattern on a cake or in combination together. We've covered some highlighting, piping, edible beading, and yeah, there's a lot in there that could be applied to other projects as well. So I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to ask any questions and enjoy using these techniques. Thank you.